For years, the retired Navy veteran Ethan Ward found his only peace in the rhythm of the sea and the company of Rex, a loyal German shepherd who once served beside him. But one fog-drenched night, Rex broke that calm. The dog, usually silent and disciplined, began barking wildly toward the dark horizon. Ethan followed, heart pounding, and there, half buried in wet sand, lay a rusted fragment of metal, stamped with fading letters. Ridian. The name hit him like a wave. It was the ghost of his past, the USS Meridian, the submarine that took his best friend 30 years ago. Was it an accident? Or a secret buried deep beneath the ocean floor? Subscribe now, because this story is just beginning. The wind from the Atlantic moved like an old song through the coastal town of Greyhaven, Maine, soft, melancholy, and endlessly repeating. The sun was sinking behind the fog banks, casting the world in the tired gold of late afternoon. At the very edge of the rocky shore stood a wooden cabin, weather-beaten but sturdy, facing the sea as if in quiet defiance. This was the home of Ethan Ward, a man whose life had become as gray and unyielding as the cliffs beneath his porch. Ethan was 54, tall and lean, with shoulders hardened by years at sea and a face carved by wind and regret. His hair, once dark, had thinned and turned the color of sea salt. A faint scar cut diagonally across his jawline, a memory from a rescue mission long ago, and his blue-gray eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much sky and too little peace. He moved with the careful economy of a man who no longer expected surprises from life. Those who met him in town spoke kindly but distantly. They said Ethan was polite but hollow, like a bell that rang only when struck by storm. Beside him, wherever he went, padded Rex, a 9-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat dulled by time and a faint silver streak running along his back. One of his ears stood upright, the other slightly bent, giving him an almost questioning expression. A thin scar crossed his flank, a token from his years in the Navy's K-9 search and rescue unit. Though age had stiffened his hind legs, his eyes still gleamed with steady intelligence and an almost human calm. To strangers, he seemed a stoic animal. To Ethan, he was the last heartbeat of loyalty left in a world that had forgotten him. Their days followed a rhythm older than habit. At dawn, Ethan would brew black coffee on a rusted stove, pour a bowl of water for Rex, and then walk to the beach. The air smelled of salt and kelp, the waves rolling like muted drums beneath the cliffs. Beyond the dunes stood the old Greyhaven lighthouse, its lantern shattered since the great storm of 2005. Its white paint had long peeled to reveal the bones of weathered brick, and vines of seagrass climbed its base like green veins reclaiming a corpse. The Coast Guard had long abandoned it, but Ethan never could. He said little about why, but locals often saw him standing beneath it at sunset, staring at its dark glass like a man watching a gravestone. Inside the cabin, life was simple and silent. Ethan kept everything neat, almost obsessively so. His bed was made with military precision, his kitchen spotless, his tools hung in symmetrical order on the wall. On the mantelpiece sat a single framed photograph. 2 young men in naval uniforms, smiling with the pride of those who still believed in indestructible things. One of them was Ethan, the other Tommy Graves, his best friend, his brother in arms, and the man he could never save. Tommy's ship, the USS Meridian, had vanished 30 years ago in the North Atlantic. Official reports claimed it sank during a technical malfunction caused by a sudden storm. But Ethan, who had once served aboard the same vessel before being reassigned, never accepted that story. He had read the report too many times, and every time, the same sentence burned through his mind like acid. Incident concluded. No further investigation required. Each night, when the sea turned black and the wind carried the cries of gulls inland, Ethan would sit on his porch with a glass of rum and the silence of memory. Rex would lie beside his boots, eyes half closed, listening to the rhythm of his master's breathing. Sometimes Ethan spoke aloud, to the wind, to the ocean, or perhaps to the ghosts that lived in both. "They say the meridian went down fast," he would mutter, his voice gravelly from years of salt air. "But I've seen ships die, Rex. They scream, they fight, they leave debris, oil, something. Meridian left nothing. Just absence." Rex would lift his head slightly at the sound of his name, the wind rippling through his fur, and then rest again, content that Ethan's ghosts were not the kind that bit. Greyhaven itself was a quiet town that had stopped growing decades ago. The docks smelled of tar and fish guts. The bar by the harbor played old country music from a jukebox that skipped every third song. The townsfolk were mostly fishermen, widows, and a few retired sailors who drank their pensions in silence. They respected Ethan, even pitied him, though none dared ask about the meridian. They had all lost someone to the sea, just not the way he had. One of the few who still checked on him from time to time was Alexei Novak, the owner of the small marine supply shop on Main Street. Alexei was a woman in her late 40s, tall and narrow as a mast, with skin the color of driftwood and hair that shimmered silver blonde under the sun. Her eyes were a cool Baltic green. She had come from Gdansk years ago, following a husband who vanished on a trawler during a nor'easter. Since then, she'd built a life of resilience and sharp humor. When she saw Ethan enter her shop, she always greeted him with a grin that bordered on mischief. "You again, Mr. Ward," she said one morning as he stood by the counter, examining a set of corroded ship lanterns. "You planning to bring that ghost tower back to life?" Ethan gave a half smile, the kind that never reached his eyes. "Just keeping the rust at bay." Alexei crossed her arms, leaning over the counter. "You and that lighthouse, two stubborn relics that won't let the sea have its way. Must be love." He shrugged. "Maybe guilt." She studied him for a moment, and though she said nothing, her expression softened. "Careful with guilt," she said finally. "It's the only storm that doesn't end." Ethan bought some kerosene, a coil of rope, and a small tin of oil for the hinges that groaned whenever the sea mist came in. As he left, Alexei called after him, "Tell Rex I saved him a bone. Big one. I think he likes me better than you." Rex wagged his tail as if confirming it, and for a brief moment, Ethan's laughter broke through the fog of his solitude, a sound rare enough to startle even the gulls. That evening, the sea grew restless. The tide came higher than usual, slapping against the rocks with impatient hands. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, though the sky above remained a pale gray. Ethan stood by the shore, oiling the old door of the lighthouse. Its metal creaked like an old man's back. Rex sniffed around the base, tail twitching, occasionally pausing to glance toward the water. The first drops fell just as the sun vanished. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against the rail, staring at the horizon where the world blurred into nothingness. It was then that he saw it, or thought he did. For an instant, a shape glimmered beneath the water far offshore, like the spine of a beast rolling under the waves. Then it was gone. "Probably driftwood," he murmured, but his heart had begun to beat faster, a slow echo of the fear he had buried for decades. He picked up the binoculars from the railing, scanned the darkening sea, and saw only foam. Behind him, Rex barked once, sharp and sudden. Ethan turned. The dog was staring into the surf, ears rigid, body tense. He barked again, lower this time, almost a growl. "What is it, boy?" Ethan stepped closer. The wind whipped at his jacket. The sea growled below. Rex advanced toward the water, sniffing the edge of the tide, then looked back at Ethan with eyes that seemed almost pleading. Ethan knelt beside him, the surf soaking his boots. In the weak light, something metallic gleamed between the rocks, a shard half buried in seaweed. He pulled it free. It was a curved plate of corroded steel, small enough to hold in one hand, stamped faintly with the letters. Ridian. For a moment he couldn't breathe. His fingers trembled, tracing the letters as if they might vanish if he blinked. No, he whispered. It can't be. The waves hissed against the shore, and far out to sea, lightning flashed behind the clouds, illuminating the broken silhouette of the lighthouse. Rex pressed his head against Ethan's knee, whining softly. The wind rose to a howl, carrying with it the scent of salt and secrets. Ethan closed his fist around the fragment, the cold metal biting into his palm. The sea roared, but in his ears he heard only the faint echo of a ship's horn. Long, mournful, and impossibly familiar. Somewhere beneath the waves, something was waiting to be found. The fog rolled in thick the next morning, a soft white shroud that swallowed the cliffs and muffled the sound of waves. The gulls circled overhead, their cries distant, as if afraid to come too close. Ethan Ward stood at the shoreline, the shard of rusted steel still cold in his palm. The letters Ridian were faint but undeniable. He turned it over in the weak light, his mind clawing at disbelief. Rex sat beside him, ears pricked, the wind ruffling the silver fur along his spine. The old dog had not taken his eyes off the sea since dawn. Ethan pocketed the metal fragment and straightened slowly. The tide was retreating, leaving behind a trail of seaweed and small shells. He felt as though the ocean had exhaled a secret just for him, something it had kept buried for 30 years. He walked back toward the cabin, Rex padding faithfully at his heel. The air smelled of salt and rain, and the path up the dunes was slick underfoot. Inside, he placed the fragment on his workbench beside an old magnifying lamp. The light revealed faint numbers etched along one edge, military serial markings, partially corroded but still legible enough to confirm his dread. Meridian. He whispered the name like a confession. That afternoon, he drove into town. The road to Greyhaven wound through pine groves that smelled of resin and wet bark. The truck rattled over the uneven asphalt, its radio long dead, leaving only the low hum of the engine. He parked outside Alexei Novak's shop, the bell over the door jingling weakly as he entered. Alexei looked up from the counter, where she was mending a fishing net. Her tall frame straightened. A few strands of silver-blonde hair slipped from her braid and caught the light like thread spun from frost. "Morning," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Mr. Ward." "Maybe I have," Ethan replied, setting the metal fragment on the counter. "You ever seen something like this?" Alexei leaned closer, her green eyes narrowing. She ran a finger gently over the corroded surface. "Military steel, old, submarine grade, I'd bet." She looked up at him, her tone sharpening. "Where'd you find it?" "Washed ashore last night, down by the lighthouse." For a long moment she said nothing. Then, softly, "You think it's from your ship?" Ethan nodded. "I don't think. I know." Alexei exhaled slowly and shook her head. "You shouldn't go chasing ghosts, Ethan. The sea buries what it wants to keep." "Maybe, but sometimes it spits things out for a reason." A faint smile ghosted across her lips. "You're a stubborn man." He gave a dry laugh. "I was a sailor. Stubbornness was the only thing they didn't teach." Alexei studied him, then the metal again. "You want a name? Someone who can verify this properly?" He hesitated. "You know someone?" There's a historian in Portland, she said, scribbling a name on a scrap of paper. Dr. Peter Hanlon, retired Navy, now works at the Naval Archives, spends most of his time arguing with ghosts of bureaucracy. Ethan pocketed the note. Thanks. She looked at him with quiet concern. Ethan, don't dig too deep. Sometimes truth is like seawater. It eats through the hull. He met her eyes for a moment, then nodded and left. The drive to Portland took 3 hours along the coast road, a stretch of gray sea and skeletal trees bent by wind. The city was louder than he remembered. Cars, voices, life that hadn't waited for him. The Naval Archives sat near the old harbor, a red brick building with iron-framed windows that smelled faintly of paper and diesel. Inside, the air was cool and dry, filled with the murmur of old secrets. Ethan found Dr. Peter Hanlon in a side office, surrounded by stacks of weathered logbooks and half-open files. Hanlon was a man in his 60s, short and round-shouldered, with a white beard that curled like sea foam and spectacles that magnified his pale blue eyes. His hands were ink-stained and restless, always tapping or turning pages. He had once been an intelligence officer, sharp-minded, with a voice that carried both warmth and warning. "You must be Ethan Ward," Hanlon said, standing to shake his hand. "Alexei called ahead, said you were bringing me a mystery." Ethan placed the fragment on his desk. "You tell me if this looks familiar." Hanlon adjusted his glasses and studied it under a lamp. Alloy composition looks mid-80s, naval manufacturing, serial markings, AF 7128. That prefix belonged to the Meridian class, didn't it? Ethan nodded grimly. USS Meridian, decommissioned, according to the records. Hanlon frowned. Decommissioned? He turned to his computer, fingers moving across the keys. That's odd. Meridian wasn't decommissioned. She was lost. Classified incident, 1995. I know, Ethan said quietly. I was reassigned a week before she disappeared. Hanlon looked up sharply. You served aboard her? For 5 years. Hanlon leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. That ship's file was sealed tighter than the president's lunch. If something's washing up now, someone's going to start sweating in Washington. Ethan's jaw tightened. They already buried the crew once. I'm not letting them do it again. Hanlon studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. All right, I'll help you dig. But understand this. Whatever happened to Meridian wasn't just an accident. And if someone wanted it forgotten, they'll make sure it stays that way. Ethan felt the old ache rise in his chest, the same one that came with every memory of Tommy's laughter. I've lived with silence long enough, he said. Hanlon gave a thin smile. Then you'll need to get dirty. He handed Ethan a printed map of the North Atlantic sector, yellowed at the corners. This is the last recorded route before the ship went off radar. The area was sealed for environmental containment. If you want to find answers, that's where you'll look. Ethan folded the map carefully and stood. Thank you. Hanlon's gaze softened. Just be careful out there. The sea doesn't give up its dead easily. When Ethan stepped back into the dusk, the city lights flickered across puddles like molten gold. He felt Rex's absence like an ache. The dog was waiting back home, guarding the cabin as faithfully as ever. The drive home was long and quiet. The fog returned as he neared Greyhaven, wrapping the cliffs in its pale breath. By the time he reached the cabin, night had fallen. The lighthouse loomed above him, its broken glass catching moonlight like an unblinking eye. Inside, Rex rose from his place by the door and stretched, tail thumping once. Ethan knelt, running a hand through the dog's fur. We're going to need a boat, boy, he murmured. Rex tilted his head, as if understanding. 2 days later, he found one. At the harbor, he met Calvin Brooks, a fisherman in his late 50s who rented boats for cash. Calvin was a broad man, sunburned and wiry, with gray hair cropped close and a permanent squint from years on the water. His voice was rough, but not unkind. "You planning to fish or drown?" he asked, as Ethan inspected the small trawler. "Something in between," Ethan replied. Calvin chuckled. "You ex-Navy boys. You never retire, do you?" "Some ghosts don't let go." Calvin's smile faded slightly. "That I understand." He nodded toward the sea. "Lost my brother out there. Trawler hit a mine that shouldn't have been there. They called it an accident. I called it a cover-up. Never found him." Ethan looked at him with quiet empathy. "Then you know why I can't stop." Calvin stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Take her out tomorrow morning. Tide'll be low. But you didn't hear that from me." Ethan pressed the man's hand in gratitude. The wind carried the smell of rain and diesel as he and Rex walked back up the pier. The foghorn moaned once in the distance. That night, as the storm gathered over Greyhaven, Ethan laid the map across his desk. His fingers traced the faint red circle marking Meridian's last known coordinates. Outside, thunder rolled over the sea like a distant cannon. He looked down at Rex, who lay by the door, eyes glowing faintly in the lamplight. "Tomorrow," he said, "we find her." The old dog wagged his tail once, slow and certain. Outside, the wind rose to a howl, and for a heartbeat, Ethan could swear he heard it again. The faint sound of a ship's horn, echoing through the dark, calling them back to where it all began. The morning broke with a gray light that seemed to come not from the sun, but from the sea itself. Mist clung to the shoreline like a living thing, rolling and curling around the rocks, as if reluctant to let go. Ethan Ward stood on the small pier beside the trawler he had borrowed from Calvin Brooks. The boat was old but seaworthy, its hull patched and its paint faded by years of salt and storms. The name Mariner's Rest was barely legible across its bow. Rex sat on the deck, tail flicking in slow, deliberate rhythm, watching every movement of his master as if understanding the weight of the day. Ethan wore a thick canvas jacket and the same boots he had kept from his Navy days. His hands moved with mechanical precision as he checked the oxygen tanks, the diving harness, and the waterproof flashlight. His face was drawn and pale, the lines around his mouth deepened by sleepless nights. When Calvin arrived, he carried with him the smell of tobacco and diesel. His expression caught between concern and curiosity. Calvin Brooks was a man carved from years at sea. Broad shoulders, arms roped with muscle, skin weathered to a deep bronze. His gray beard was trimmed short, and his eyes were the dull blue of an overcast horizon. There was a sadness there, the kind that lingers when a man has spent too long waiting for an answer that never came. He climbed aboard with the ease of habit and lit a cigarette despite the wind. "You sure about this, Ward?" he asked. "That area's been off limits since before you were gray." Ethan tightened a strap on the tank and gave a brief nod. "I've spent 30 years not knowing. I'm done waiting." Calvin exhaled smoke toward the mist. "Fair enough. But ghosts down there. Some don't like company." Rex gave a low growl, as if echoing the sentiment, then trotted to the stern, nose twitching at the scent of the sea. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life, vibrating through the deck like a heart beginning to beat again. They left Greyhaven as the tide turned. The coastline faded into fog, and soon there was nothing but the restless gray sea stretching out in every direction. Ethan stood by the bow, gripping the rail, eyes locked on the coordinates scribbled onto a waterproof map. The ocean had changed since the last time he'd sailed it. It seemed heavier, older, filled with memories. He glanced down at Rex, who leaned against the wind with quiet defiance, his fur rippling like smoke. After 2 hours, Calvin cut the engine. The silence that followed was immense, broken only by the hiss of water against the hull. "This is it," he said. "If your numbers are right, Meridian's sleeping somewhere beneath us." Ethan's stomach tightened. He pulled on the diving mask, adjusted the straps, and checked the gauges. The world shrank to the rhythm of his own breathing. Calvin handed him the waterproof camera and a small handheld sonar device. "Stay within the perimeter." "Dufour," fisherman warned. "Currents down there are tricky." Ethan gave a curt nod, then looked down at Rex. "Stay with Calvin, boy. Guard the boat." Rex whined softly but sat down, his gaze fixed on Ethan with quiet loyalty. The old sailor hesitated for only a moment longer before stepping onto the platform. The sea accepted him with a cold embrace, closing over his head with a muted roar. Beneath the surface, the world turned green and ghostly. Light fractured into ribbons, swaying with the current. Schools of silver fish darted through the water, vanishing into the gloom. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs as he descended, the pressure building in his ears. The sonar gave soft, rhythmic beeps, guiding him through the hazy water. Then he saw it, a shape forming out of the murk. The USS Meridian lay tilted on her side, half buried in sand and coral, a steel leviathan frozen mid-dive. Her hull was split near the stern, gaping like a wound. Time had draped her in moss and sea growth, but the lettering was still faintly visible. Meridian, SSN 714. Ethan's breath caught. For a long moment he could not move. Memories flooded him. Tommy's laughter, the smell of oil and iron, the echo of footsteps in narrow corridors. The ghosts had faces now. He swam closer, running a gloved hand along the cold metal. Near the rear hatch, the sonar pinged sharply, something metallic trapped beneath debris. He dug carefully, freeing a small steel case tangled in old netting. The case was sealed tight, its surface scarred but intact. His heart pounded. He clipped it to his harness and turned to leave, but a faint glimmer caught his eye. The light from his torch fell upon the open crack in the hull. Inside, beyond the broken steel ribs, something moved. A trick of light, perhaps, or the ghost of motion. The silence was absolute, but Ethan could almost swear he heard a faint hum, like a whisper in the deep. He shuddered and kicked upward, lungs burning. The surface burst around him in a shower of gray water. Calvin leaned over the side, grabbing his arm to haul him aboard. "You found something?" Ethan nodded, gasping for air. "The stern's open. I think the hull was breached from inside." Calvin frowned. "Inside? That doesn't make sense." "Neither does 30 years of silence," Ethan said, pulling off the mask. Rex barked twice, tail thrashing, the relief in his eyes almost human. Ethan reached out and scratched behind his ear, murmuring, "Good boy, we did it." Once they anchored in calmer water, Ethan pried open the steel case with a screwdriver from Calvin's toolbox. Inside, wrapped in waterproof oilcloth, lay a bundle of papers, faded but legible. He unfolded one, and his stomach turned. It was a letter, written in the familiar, slanted handwriting of Tommy Graves. The first words blurred as Ethan's vision swam. "If anyone finds this, it means we didn't make it." The letter went on to describe the crew's final hours, the rattle of failing systems, the order to remain silent, the strange chemical cargo that had begun to leak. Tommy's words grew shakier near the end. "We were carrying something that should never have gone to sea. They knew it. When the alarms sounded, they sealed us in, said it was containment protocol. But it wasn't the sea that killed us, Ethan. It was silence." By the time he finished reading, the world around him felt distant, muffled by grief and rage. Calvin stood nearby, hat in hand, his face pale beneath the tan. "Jesus," he whispered. "They buried the truth." Ethan nodded slowly, closing the letter with trembling hands. "And they buried my friend." A cold wind swept across the deck, scattering droplets of seawater like tears. The mist thickened, curling around the boat in translucent sheets. Rex began to whine softly, staring out toward the horizon. Then came the sound, low and mournful, carried by the fog. A single, distant horn, deep and resonant, like the call of a ship from another time. Calvin's head jerked up. "You hear that?" Ethan's throat tightened. "It's the Meridian." The horn came again, fainter this time, swallowed by the wind. The air grew heavy, charged with something unseen. Rex lifted his muzzle and howled, a long, echoing cry that rose and fell in harmony with the sea. For a few heartbeats, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the fog began to thin, and the light shifted, a faint beam breaking through from above, glinting off the water like a single tear of sunlight. Ethan turned his face toward it, whispering into the wind, "Rest easy, Tommy. You're home." The foghorn's echo faded into silence, leaving only the steady rhythm of the waves. The next morning came cold and colorless. Greyhaven seemed caught between seasons, its harbor wrapped in mist so dense that the fishing boats looked like ghosts adrift. Ethan Ward stood on the pier beside Mariner's Rest, the salt still clinging to his jacket, the damp wind stinging his face. The steel case and the letters from Tommy lay locked in a weathered toolbox at his feet. He hadn't slept. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the wreck, its silent corridors, its open wound, and heard the echo of that final horn that had risen from nowhere. Calvin Brooks approached from the dockside cafe, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. The man's face looked more tired than usual, the lines around his mouth carved deep. "I called the Coast Guard office in Portland," he said quietly. "Told them what you found." Ethan accepted the coffee, his hands trembling slightly from cold. "And?" Calvin's gaze drifted out towards the horizon. "They said they'll send a team, but the tone changed the second I mentioned the word Meridian, like I'd cursed into the phone." "They'll come," Ethan murmured, "but not to thank us." Calvin nodded grimly. "You're probably right." 2 hours later, a white patrol boat emerged from the fog, slicing through the still water. The insignia of the U.S. Coast Guard gleamed faintly along its hull. On deck stood Lieutenant Samuel Price, a man who looked too young for the stiffness in his posture. He was maybe in his early 30s, tall and neatly built, his uniform immaculate despite the salt air. His short blonde hair was combed with mathematical precision, and his gray eyes carried both discipline and fatigue, the kind of weariness that comes from obeying orders you don't believe in. When he stepped onto the dock, he extended a gloved hand. "Mr. Ward, Lieutenant Price, Coast Guard Intelligence Division." His voice was firm, but not unkind. "We received your report about the discovery." Ethan shook his hand, his grip steady. "You mean the Meridian?" Price's jaw tightened, just slightly. "The vessel in question was decommissioned decades ago. Officially." "Officially," Ethan repeated, letting the word hang like a stone in the air. The young officer hesitated before gesturing toward the patrol boat. "If you'll accompany us, sir, we'd like to verify the site." Calvin started to protest, but Ethan raised a hand. "It's all right. I'll go." He turned to Rex, who stood watching with alert eyes. "Stay with Calvin, boy." Rex gave a low growl, but obeyed, pressing his nose against Ethan's sleeve one last time before sitting by the fisherman's feet. The ride to the coordinates was silent, except for the thrum of the engines. The fog began to thin, revealing a pale strip of horizon. Lieutenant Price stood at the bow, scanning the sonar monitor with his crew, a group of young sailors, faces unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. Ethan sat. Opposite them, the weight of Tommy's words echoing in his mind. When they reached the marked zone, Price gave a series of orders. The sonar confirmed the presence of the submarine beneath the silt. Divers went down. Minutes later they surfaced with fragments, rusted steel, corroded wiring, a plate bearing partial serial numbers. One diver climbed aboard, holding a plastic container sealed underwater. Inside it was a torn scrap of cloth, part of a Navy uniform, the faded insignia of the Meridian still visible. Price stared at it for a long moment before exhaling softly. Enough to confirm, but not enough to reopen the case, he muttered, almost to himself. Then louder, "Mr. Ward, the remains of the vessel will be documented, but the operation will go no further. That's direct from command." Ethan rose to his feet, disbelief flashing in his eyes. "You're shutting it down, after what we found?" Price's expression didn't change, but his voice lowered. "Off the record, you've seen more than they want the public to know. Do yourself a favor. Let the sea keep its dead." The words landed like lead. Ethan turned away, staring at the gray water that hid so much and revealed so little. He felt something twist inside him. Anger, grief, the sharp taste of futility. But beneath it all, a single thought burned bright. If they won't tell the truth, I will. By evening, the patrol boat had vanished into fog again, leaving Ethan standing alone on the dock with the case under his arm. Calvin approached slowly, one hand resting on Rex's collar. "They shut you down, didn't they?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, but not for long." That night, he sat at his desk by the window while the storm built outside. The wind rattled the glass, and the lighthouse loomed in silhouette against flashes of lightning. Rex lay near the door, ears twitching with each rumble of thunder. On the table, Ethan spread the letters and the water-stained pages from the case, photographing each one carefully. His hands were steady now, his movements deliberate. When he finished, he composed an email addressed to a name he hadn't spoken in years. Claire Donovan. Claire had once served as a war correspondent before turning investigative journalist. She was in her 40s now, sharp-minded, with the calm poise of someone who had stared at danger too long to flinch. Ethan remembered her from the Gulf years. Short auburn hair, pale freckled skin, and a voice that could slice through bureaucratic lies like a blade through paper. The last time he'd seen her, she'd been dragging a camera through desert sand while bullets cracked overhead. Her reply came within hours. "Ethan Ward. Haven't heard that name in 2 decades. If what you're saying is real, I'm coming to Greyhaven. Keep the documents safe, and watch your back." By the next afternoon, her car rolled into the fog-wrapped harbor town. Claire stepped out, wearing a dark coat and boots, flecked with travel dust. Her green eyes scanned the horizon, alert and assessing. When she saw Ethan waiting by the pier, she smiled faintly. "You always did pick dramatic weather," she said. "Couldn't be Greyhaven without fog," he replied. Inside the cabin, Ethan laid the documents on the table, while Rex sniffed cautiously around her, tail wagging once. Claire crouched to scratch his head. "You've got a loyal guard." "The only one left who doesn't ask questions," Ethan said quietly. They spent hours reviewing the letters, the photos, the coordinates, and the sonar data. Claire's brow furrowed deeper with each page. "This isn't just negligence," she said finally. "It's deliberate erasure. Chemical cargo, sealed compartments, falsified decommissioning records. Someone built a grave and called it maintenance." Ethan nodded. "And the men who died in it deserve more than silence." Claire leaned back, tapping a pen against her lip. If we publish this, it'll hit hard. But they'll fight it. They'll deny everything, maybe even threaten you. I've lived under ghosts for 30 years, he said. I can handle threats. She met his gaze, her expression softening. You really haven't changed. Neither have you, he said, and for the first time in days, a faint smile crossed his face. By dawn, the article was finished. The Ghost Crew of USS Meridian. Claire's words carried weight, grounded in evidence, written with quiet fury and reverence. She sent it to her editor before sunrise. By midday, it had gone live across every major news outlet. The world reacted faster than Ethan could breathe. The Navy issued statements of ongoing review. Families of lost sailors demanded answers. Reporters flooded the harbor. And when the government finally spoke, it was with the trembling voice of concession. A public inquiry was opened. The men of the Meridian were to be honored posthumously. Weeks later, under a gray sky streaked with rain, Ethan stood before a new memorial carved in granite. The names of the crew shimmered under the thin drizzle. He found Tommy Graves halfway down the list, his hand resting on the letters as if he could still feel the warmth of his friend's laughter. Beside him, Rex sat still as a statue, his coat darkened by rain, eyes fixed on the horizon. A crowd murmured behind them, officials, sailors, families, but Ethan heard only the sea. Somewhere in the wind, faint but certain, he thought he heard the echo of a horn, one long, low note carrying peace instead of warning. He closed his eyes and whispered, "You're home, brother." The wind carried the scent of salt and pine through the air, soft and cool against the cliffs of Greyhaven. 3 years had passed since the truth about the USS Meridian came to light, and time had wrapped the town in a kind of quiet pride. The lighthouse, once a broken skeleton of stone and rust, now stood tall again, its lantern restored to life. Each night, its golden beams swept slowly across the waves, a watchful eye over the sea that had taken so much and finally given something back. Ethan Ward climbed the spiral staircase with the careful pace of age. His joints ached, but the rhythm of the climb had become as familiar as breathing. At 60 now, his frame had thinned, his beard turned fully silver, and his hands bore the pale calluses of a man who still worked with them daily. His blue-gray eyes, once clouded with grief, now carried a gentler weight, the quiet wisdom of someone who had stopped running from ghosts. At the base of the tower, Rex waited patiently. The German shepherd was old now, almost 12. His once deep sable coat faded to ash. He moved slower, his steps stiff with years, but his eyes still glimmered with alert devotion. Around his neck hung a simple brass tag engraved with one word: Meridian. Ethan had replaced the old collar the year the memorial was built, saying, "You've earned your commission too, old boy." The lighthouse keep's small living quarters had been restored, along with the tower. It was simple: one bed, a wood stove, a table where Ethan kept a journal, and a framed photograph of Tommy Graves. The town had insisted he take the role of volunteer keeper after the restoration, calling him the man who gave the sea its conscience back. Ethan had resisted at first, saying he was too old for titles, but in truth, the lighthouse had always belonged to him, even before its light returned. That evening, as the sun bled orange into the horizon, Ethan stood on the outer balcony, hands resting on the cool iron rail. The sea stretched endless before him, restless but no longer cruel. Behind him, the beam of the lighthouse rotated with a slow hum. The rhythm of its light seemed to match the beating of his heart. A voice called from below. "You're early tonight, Mr. Ward." He looked down to see Martha Cole, a woman in her early 50s with auburn hair streaked with gray, climbing the path toward the lighthouse. She was the curator of the small maritime museum the town had built near the docks, a lively woman with kind brown eyes and a quick smile. Her husband had been one of the carpenters who helped rebuild the tower. Martha carried a wicker basket under one arm, waving it up toward him. "Brought you dinner before it gets cold." Ethan smiled faintly. "You're going to spoil me, Martha." She grinned. "Somebody has to. The town's hero can't live on canned beans and black coffee." He descended the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath his boots. When he opened the door, the smell of fresh bread and fish stew drifted up. Martha brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "The mayor says they're planning to add a plaque at the memorial. Your name this time. Took them 3 years to convince you're not the type to protest." Ethan chuckled. "Tell the mayor he can keep the plaque. I've got enough ghosts talking to me without adding my own." Martha laughed softly. "You're still the same stubborn man, Ethan Ward." She looked around the room, her eyes resting on the photograph of Tommy. "You come up here every night, don't you?" Ethan nodded. "Someone has to keep the light on. For them." Martha placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, her voice gentler now. "You already did that. The whole town knows it." After she left, the light faded from the sky, leaving the sea wrapped in silver mist. Ethan ate quietly while Rex dozed near the door, paws twitching in some distant dream. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily, the sound blending with the low hum of the beacon. Later, Ethan stepped outside again. The night air was sharp but clean. He walked along the narrow wooden pier, the boards creaking underfoot. Rex followed slowly behind, his breath visible in the chill. The stars were faint, blurred by the constant roll of fog, but the beam from the lighthouse sliced through it like a promise. Ethan reached the small monument at the foot of the tower. The bronze statue depicted a sailor saluting the sea, his dog at his side. Beneath them, engraved in brass, were the words, "To the crew of the USS Meridian, who kept their silence so that truth might one day speak." Below the inscription were 32 names: Tommy Graves, Charles Niles, Captain Hargreaves, every man who had gone down with the ship. The townspeople had built it from donations, every bolt and plaque forged by hands that had once turned away from the ocean in fear. Now, they came every Sunday to lay flowers by the statue. Ethan knelt before the monument, his knees protesting, his breath steady. Rex eased down beside him, resting his head against Ethan's boot. For a long moment they simply listened, to the hush of the waves, the distant cry of gulls, and the faint mechanical pulse of the lighthouse sweeping the dark. He spoke softly, the words barely louder than the tide. "Tommy, you were right. They heard you. The world knows now." A wave crashed against the rocks below, its spray catching the light. Ethan smiled faintly. "You always said the sea was a patient teacher." Rex gave a quiet grunt, leaning his head heavier on Ethan's foot. Ethan looked down and stroked the old dog's ear. "We're still here, you and I, keeping watch." He rose slowly and walked back toward the pier's end. The beam of the lighthouse passed over him, gilding his silver hair and weathered coat in a soft gold. The sea stretched outward, vast, eternal, yet finally at peace. As the night deepened, he sat on the edge of the pier with Rex lying close. The air hummed with the soft rhythm of waves brushing wood. Ethan's thoughts wandered to the faces of the men he'd served with, to the laughter shared in cramped corridors, to the sound of Tommy's voice calling him brother. The ache in his chest no longer burned. It was a steady warmth now, like embers that refused to die out. A faint sound reached him through the wind, a ship's horn, far in the distance, echoing softly through the fog. He didn't startle this time. He just listened, smiling as the sound faded into the heartbeat of the ocean. The lighthouse's beam swung again, catching the monument in its glow, the bronze faces shimmering as if alive. Ethan closed his eyes and whispered, "You're home now, Tommy. All of you." Rex stirred, lifted his head, and nudged Ethan's hand. The old man chuckled quietly. "Yes, you too, old boy." They sat together until the stars blurred and the horizon turned pale. When the first light of dawn touched the water, Ethan stood, leaning on the rail. The sea glittered with a soft, forgiving light. The lighthouse's beam faded as the sun rose, surrendering its duty for another day. He turned toward the cabin, Rex following with careful steps. At the threshold, Ethan looked back one last time. The tower stood strong against the brightening sky, its lens gleaming like a guardian eye. The sea beyond shimmered gold, carrying whispers of old souls homeward. "Come on, partner," Ethan said quietly. "Let's keep the light ready." And as they disappeared into the tower's warmth, the beam swept once more across the horizon. Steady, bright, eternal. Sometimes, the miracles we wait for are not thunder from the heavens, but quiet lights that return to us after years of darkness. A truth found, a friend remembered, a soul forgiven. Like Ethan and his faithful Rex, we are all keepers of some small lighthouse within us, guiding others through storms they may never see. Perhaps that is how God works, through patience, love, and the courage to do what is right even when no one is watching. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes that light can return after loss. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you can walk with us through more stories of hope, redemption, and faith. May God bless and protect you and your loved ones, and may the light within you never fade.